The United Nations has become worse than a loathsome character in a bad reality show, habitually exhibiting signs that range from ostentatious, whinny, sloppy, and overwhelmingly incompetent. Or maybe the organization was always this way, and many of us are just now getting the memo. Of course, the UN will tell you it is a remarkable, much-needed institution dedicated to addressing every global issue imaginable, except for the perennial annoyance known as Israel. From climate change to poverty, from gender equality to global health, the UN is tirelessly concerned about everything, just not Israel. But it is one thing to disregard Israel and, by extension, the Jews. It is a whole other thing for the UN to become another front in the fight against the Jewish state, belting claims that range from baseless to overly exaggerated, while shilling for Palestinian terrorists and their Iranian and Qatari sponsors. Wherever there is an enemy of Israel, you will find the UN, curled up like a newborn puppy with his mother. Like any organization, the UN is a product of its people, and boy, do UN employees know how to pick a side. Last week, as tensions continued to mount between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made another of his now marquee crack-brained comments, saying, quote, "One rash move, one miscalculation, could trigger a catastrophe that goes far beyond the border, and frankly, beyond imagination. Let's be clear. The people of the region and the people of the world cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza." Beyond imagination? Maybe for him, a dimwit without a working brain, but for goodness sake, who thought hyperbole could be injected with human growth hormone? That said, I am glad that Guterres brought up Gaza, because for years the Strip has been hijacked by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They kill homosexuals, throw political opponents off the top of buildings, and quell the rights of women. Meanwhile, the UN Agency for so-called Palestinian Refugees, known as UNRWA, commands $1 billion plus annual budget, which Palestinian terrorist organizations swipe to smuggle weapons and explosives into the Strip. To add insult to injury, UNRWA has continued to send money from its bank account in New York City to Gaza to fund schools and hospitals and pay staffers, despite knowing that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad siphon part of the cash to fund terrorism, which, of course, the Islamist puppet Guterres did not say a damn thing about. Then, after the worst terror attack on Israel emanating out of Gaza, Guterres and other UN imbeciles incessantly pulled out their megaphones to wail and scream about people in Gaza running out of everything: food, water, medicine, fuel, rockets, everything. It has been 266 days of Gaza running out of everything by tomorrow. The UN was established in 1945 with the goal of promoting peace, security, and cooperation among nations. Interestingly enough, Israel has achieved peace, security, and cooperation with every country that has wanted it, including most recently the Muslim nation of Indonesia, whereas Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are genocidal, caliphate-pining terrorist organizations. One of these things is not like the other, and you do not have to look all that closely. What's more, the UN Charter specifically aims to prevent conflict, yet at least once of its agencies, UNRWA, knew that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were planning for war and did nothing about it. Now, they are vying for even more funding to continue aiding and abetting Palestinian terrorist organizations in their forever war against the Jewish state. One of UNRWA's key fundraisers is UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who has been operating an international network entitled the Global Network on Question of Palestine, aimed at harming Israel, according to a UN Watch report published earlier this month. Via the Global Network on Question of Palestine, the report stated that Albanese has been coordinating legal campaigns against Israel, justifying Hamas's actions, and advocating for the funding of UNRWA. To encourage UNRWA funding, people in Albanese's network were told to utilize, quote, overtly racist messaging to raise the subjects of, quote, illegal immigration in Europe, specifically when speaking with right-wing and anti-immigration governmental officials. According to the report, this would fuel the fear that failing to fund UNRWA would signify that, quote, millions of Palestinians are forced to flee the Middle East. UNRWA, you might recall, has been accused by Israeli intelligence services of employing hundreds of Hamas operatives, including dozens who participated in the October 7th massacres. Never mind that the IDF recently discovered a major Hamas data center directly underneath UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza. What a coincidence. And yet, the UN rot extends far beyond UNRWA and its con artists. UN Women waited nearly 2 months before issuing a both-sides statement on the Palestinians' use of sexual violence as a tool of war. Its executive director used the 100-day mark of this current conflict to finally say anything about anything, opting for overly ambiguous language, quote, for all those affected, before, 2 sentences later, calling out the, quote, unparalleled destruction rained on the people of Gaza. Then, the United Nations Satellite Center published a report that said 55% of buildings in Gaza have either been destroyed or damaged. UNRWA doubled down on this report earlier this month, claiming that more than 50% of buildings had been completely destroyed, citing the aforementioned report, even enough it made no such claim. This prompted the IDF to look into these figures, and they were nowhere close to what the Israeli data found. Destruction caused to Gaza's infrastructure by the ongoing war points to 16%, or some 6,000 of Gaza's permanent structures, being damaged beyond repair in the war, according to a report released this week by the Israeli news site Ynet. Either way, what exactly does the UN expect? That Israel will tolerate a genocidal war against it? That Jews, just 80 years after the Holocaust, are going to roll over as modern-day Nazis come strolling into our streets pogrom style? It is long overdue for the UN to actually do its job, like protecting human rights globally, on behalf of all member states, Israel included. If you bitch about all the women and children in Gaza, but don't have much to say about the women and children in Israel, then you are not a humanitarian apolitical organization, and you should be dealt with as such. Let me be more clear. If you are taking sides in this war, like the UN so obviously has, then its infrastructure and employees are fair game for the IDF to do whatever it feels it needs to do to protect the state of Israel and its people, no questions asked. Sorry, not sorry. Since the October 7th massacres, every day seemingly brings more stories about alleged connections between Hamas and the UN, most prominently UNRWA. This UN agency was established in 1949 after the Israeli War of Independence, in order to provide shelter, welfare, and health services for hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. They refused to be absorbed into the new countries because they understood that this would mean they had lost the war, started by the Arabs, against Israel, and they have not been willing to accept defeat to this day, despite the Arabs starting and losing war after war. In 1950, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was founded to handle all of the world's refugees. However, following pressure from Arab countries, the Palestinian refugees remain the sole responsibility of UNRWA, which to this day remains the world's only refugee agency dedicated to a specific population. If the mission of any refugee agency is to resettle people and end their refugee status, UNRWA has failed miserably. Over the years, there were changes and simplifications for the terms to receive refugee status and the eligibility of descendants to receive services from the agency. At first, only those who had lost their home and livelihood as a result of the 1948 war were considered refugees, with the definition later broadened to include their children. But beginning in 1982, the right to be defined as a refugee was expanded to include every generation of descendants. In other words, even the great-grandchild of a refugee is also considered a refugee. As a result, in its 74-year existence, the number of UNRWA beneficiaries has grown from 700,000 refugees to almost 6 million by 2022. This includes 1.6 million people in Gaza, a fourth generation of refugees, which is largely perpetuated by the UNRWA quasi-eligibility requirements. With the increase in the number of refugees, UNRWA has become a vast organization with a turnover of more than $1 billion annually, a sum that is constantly increasing given the rise in the number of refugees, and a huge part of the Palestinian education, health, and welfare systems. About 60% of its budget is allocated to Palestinian schools, which play a pronounced role in the Palestinians' fairy tale desire for the so-called right of return, as well as their rejection of a neighboring Jewish state via anti-Semitic armed resistance. Since the October 7th Palestinian massacre in Israel, UNRWA workers and students have openly identified with Hamas on social media, and some of them were directly involved in the actual terrorism. A few months ago, for instance, it was reported that one of the released Israeli hostages said he had been held in the home of an UNRWA teacher, a father of 10 who barely gave him any food and medicine. The IDF has also revealed that dozens of rockets and other arms were found under UNRWA crates in the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, research institutes which have been tracking the organization for many years revealed that many members of the Nukba force, the elite Hamas unit that led the massacre, and additional Hamas members who perpetrated the slaughter, are UNRWA employees. But these are merely points of a much greater problem. The United Nations has become a key player in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, serving entities and people who have no interest in seeing it resolved.